Okay.
Okay. All right. So I am going to tell you about peer-assisted learning strategies, and maybe a little bit about data-based instruction if we have time and if you're interested. But are you all familiar at all with PALS? PALS, peer-assisted learning strategies? No. All right. Well, I will tell you about it.
Thank you.
And this is something that I have been working with for a very long time. When I was a graduate student, my mentor was developing PALS, and I worked as a graduate assistant as PALS was being developed. So I spent a lot of time doing some of the research and working with teachers who were helping with that research. So I'll tell a little bit more about that as we go. So now is it going to actually move through here? There we go. Okay, so PALS, what we'll do is we'll start just by giving a brief overview of what it is, what the different components are. Then I'll explain some of the research that's been conducted, and then we'll talk about some of the implications for doing PALS in Armenian context, if that's of interest to you all. So first of all, PALS stands for Peer Assisted Learning Strategies, and it's exactly what it sounds like. So students who are with their peers in the classroom, and it's usually done in the general education classroom, work together with partners, so they're paired together, and they learn strategies that are designed to help them be better learners in general. And there's PALS in reading, which is what I'll talk about today. There's also PALS in math, which I don't know as much about. But the general idea is that they're learning strategies that they can apply to any text that they're reading, or to, in the case of math, as they're working on math problems. And basically it's a class-wide peer tutoring program. So all of the students in a classroom are paired together, and there's always a first reader and a second reader. The first reader is the stronger reader, and they usually read first to provide a good model for the other student. And the second reader is the weaker reader of the pair, and they have the role of being a coach. And they learn very specific procedures for being the coach. So there's particular questions that they ask, and correction procedures that they use. So it's a really structured interaction between the coach and the reader that the teacher teaches them how to do before they have to do it on their own. And it's really designed to supplement core reading instruction. So in grades 2 through 6, which is what we'll talk about for the most part today, the focus is on reading fluency and comprehension. But it's not just teaching them how to read fluently, it's more designed to support what the teacher might have already been teaching in the classroom. I'll just mention briefly that there's a younger version of PALS for kindergarten and first grade. The version of PALS at those levels focus on letter sounding, decoding, sight word recognition, and fluency. So instead of reading connected text, they're practicing letter sounds like you see on the screen. So they might have a little sheet like this, and there's two students working together. The one who's the coach would point to each letter and say what sound, and the reader would say the sounds. And they would help each other if they weren't sure of what the sounds were. And then the same with the what we call sight words, which are just words that they should be able to recognize. And then decodable words, which are basically words that they can read by saying the sounds of the letter and blending them together. So they practice those in first grade and in kindergarten, but I won't talk about that in a lot of detail unless you have specific questions. And at any point, if you have questions, feel free to ask.
I have a question. In the kindergarten program, they have to learn a child to read and to know letters and to write letters. Yes.
Yep. In kindergarten, there is a very strong emphasis now on beginning reading skills. That's been an emphasis maybe for the last decade or so, 17 years or so, whereas before in kindergarten it was much more play and maybe learning the letters, and that was it. But now there's much more focus on early literacy. So we'll spend most of our time talking about PALS for grades 2 through 6. So that's kids who are about 7 to 8 years old and up. We also have PALS in high school for secondary level students, and it's very similar to what I'll describe here. So basically, PALS consists of 4 reading activities that kids do in pairs. The first 10 minutes is partner reading, then they do a 2-minute retell, 10 minutes of paragraph shrinking, and 10 minutes of prediction relay, and I'll explain each of those activities. We have a point system for motivation, and I'll explain that too. And once students learn how to do PALS, they do it for 3 times per week, and it takes about 35 to 40 minutes per session. So it's not something that's done every day, it's interspersed with other things that the teacher might do. We always recommend a minimum of 16 weeks because the research that has been done for 16 weeks at least. If you did less than that, we're not sure if they'd be as likely to make the same kinds of gains as we've seen in research. These are some samples of materials, and I brought my manual. It's kind of falling apart, but if you'd like to take a look at it. And basically what's in the manual are very structured lessons. So the teacher actually has scripts to follow. So there's bolded text that's what the teacher says. Then there's directions to the teacher. There's an outline to follow if the teacher doesn't like reading the scripts. But these scripts are all there to help the teacher teach the students how to do the activities. And then once they've gone through those lessons, then PALS is just done the same way every time. So teachers don't need the scripts forever. They just need them to teach the students how to do PALS. And then there's also materials in the manual, like there's text that the students can read that the teacher can use to practice the different skills. There's there's things they can hang up in their room to remind students how to do the different strategies. So there's just extra materials. They have rules to follow. There's extra materials that the teacher can use and it's basically everything they need to implement PALS in that manual. So,
can we have it?
Do you have an electronic version? I don't believe there's an electronic version of the manual. I can show you where to order the manual, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not available electronically.
Do you have a copy on your purchase?
I don't. I should, but I always end up somehow giving them away, and then I have that one.
But we can purchase one, and then when we come to Armenia, we can bring it.
Okay.
Yeah, if
Or
you like
you could
it.
just order it and have it shipped.
Or have it shipped too. Yeah.
Which
So
would probably be easier than carrying one more thing back in your luggage.
yeah.
Bring a scale.
No, bring a scale. In your luggage, you can bring it with you.
Yes.
Yeah.
He knows everything.
So these are the students' materials, and I brought a sample. So it's really nice to have these. These don't come with PALS, these folders, but they're really nice for organizing the materials if you have this sort of 2-pocket folder. I went to England last year and they don't have these. Like we went all over the place and couldn't find
Each country has its
2-pocket.
own.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if you can find these, they're really handy. And there's these cards that actually, there's templates in the manual and you can print them out on whatever colored paper you want. It doesn't have to be colored. It's just helpful to tell students, pull out the yellow card if they know what you mean. And then I'll talk about the point sheet. But basically, a pair of students would share one set of materials. So there's cards that they use. There's the point sheet. And then it's nice to have a pencil. We have bookmarks in there that you can print and cut out. And then the students read from books, which don't come with PALS as a program. The books are selected by the teacher. So whatever you would want your students to be reading, that's what you would use for PALS. Now, before we get into the activities themselves, I'll talk about how we pair the students. So basically, we use whatever information we have about their reading skill level. So if you have assessment information, the teacher's knowledge of how that student or how the students are performing, you rank order from the top highest performing child to the lowest low performing child. And then we split the list in half and pair students so that the top child from the high performing list is paired with the top child from the sort of bottom half of the list. And that way there's not a huge gap between the pairs. We want them to be somewhat different so that there's a stronger reader and a weaker reader, but we don't want to pair the strongest reader with the weakest reader because that would be too much of a gap. And they might be frustrated with each other, or it might be hard to find reading material that's really appropriate for them. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about the pairing? Okay. And then as far as texts go, again, it's up to the teacher to select whatever books you feel are appropriate. But it's really important that the texts are readable to the students. And the general rule that we follow is that the text should be such that the weaker reader isn't making more than 10 mistakes per 100 words. So we don't want them to be frustrated with reading the text, but they don't have to be able to read it completely independently. And then within a classroom, every pair can be reading from different texts because they're working one-on-one. So they don't all have to be reading the same book. So stronger readers in the classroom might be reading more advanced books, whereas weaker readers might be reading easier books.
Children with special needs, can they be as a peer for?
Yep. If they
differences will be big, so for.
Yeah, and what you can do, depending on their reading skill level, if they're really reading at a much lower level than most of the kids in the class, you might pair them with the otherwise lowest performing reader and make sure that the reading material is easy enough that they can both read that. But it does depend on the skill level of the child. So if they're not reading connected text at all, if they're not engaging in books at this point, then this might not be the most appropriate strategy. They have to be able to read at some level.
But could they use the kindergarten PALS?
They could use kindergarten PALS, so they could be doing something more like this, practicing letter sounds and more at a more basic level.
Means that you should find two people in this level.
Or similar.
Similar.
Yeah, one
Similar.
Yes,
can be or should be a little bit higher.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
a little bit, but not.
Not too much. Yeah.
Or if, I've worked in schools where they do PALS from kindergarten on up to 5th grade or so. And if there's a child in 2nd grade who really isn't reading in books yet and could benefit from something like this, they actually go to the kindergarten classroom and help. And then they're actually working on the right material, and also sometimes it helps with their self-esteem, like they're going and helping the kindergartners, but they're also learning from it as well. And then, so I'll talk through each of the activities. So the first one is partner reading. And the purpose here is just developing reading fluency. So not only so they recognize the words on the page, but they're reading smoothly and clearly, and so that they can understand what they're reading. So they always sit side by side, like the two children in the picture. They share one copy of the book. And the way that it works is the first reader reads for 5 minutes, and we always emphasize reading quickly, carefully, and with expression. And by that we mean like pausing at the periods and the commas and reading as if you're telling a story, not just kind of speeding through it. And while they're reading, the second reader is the coach, and their job is to listen and follow along with their partner and not just be looking out the window or something like that, helping with mistakes and hard words, and then marking 1 point for each sentence. So they do that for 5 minutes, and then they switch roles and repeat reading the same text. So
the same text.
Yep. So the first reader has read aloud. They're the stronger reader, so they're providing a good model. And then the second reader goes back and reads that same text after having the model. As they're reading, the coach should be listening and helping with mistakes. So if the reader does make a mistake with a word, the coach follows this procedure. So first they would point to the word that was read in error, and they would say, check it. And then the reader could either on the left side say, I need some help. And the coach would say, that word is whatever. Ask what word, the reader says the word correctly, and the coach says, good, read the sentence again. And the reader rereads the sentence. Or when the coach says check it, down the right side, the reader might just correct him or herself and say the word correctly, in which case the coach would say, good, read the sentence again, just to make sure they could read it correctly. And the reader reads the sentence again. And then they always get a point on this point sheet, and you can see a better example here. So this is just a little grid of numbers, and every time they read a sentence correctly, they're just going to draw a line through one of the numbers. And it's really just designed to be kind of motivating for students.
For one sentence.
Yep, mark 1 point. So they always
Is it
have,
too big or no?
well, so they're doing this across quite a few days together.
No,
So
okay.
it could take a couple of weeks to fill in the whole
Okay.
sheet, but
Here. For each of them, they should have
so with the pair, we would share
with the
between
parents.
two students. So if we were a pair and you were reading, I'd be following along, and every time you read a sentence correctly, I would mark 1 point. And then when it's my turn to read, you would be marking the points.
The same sheet?
Yep, and we just keep adding on to whatever the last number was. So it's just cumulatively adding points.
But if it's wrong, no, nothing done.
Yep, so if a child makes a mistake while they're reading, there's no point, but then they go through this procedure of correcting the mistake, and once they reread the sentence correctly, then they get a point. So they should always get a point eventually, but they have to have done it correctly. Yep. So then after doing the partner reading for 10 minutes total, because each student did it for 5 minutes, we do a retell activity. And the purpose is to build comprehension by being able to retell events in sequence. So they're still with their partner. Now the second reader has finished reading, and so they will retell whatever they read. And the way that works, they have this question card. So the prompts are right on there, and the coach just asks these questions. What happened first? What happened next? And they keep asking what happened next for about 2 minutes. And the second reader is the one just saying what happened throughout what they read. Then after 2 minutes, they can earn up to 10 points, and that's up to the partners to decide. So if they think that they did a really good job, they mark 10 points on their sheet. If they felt like they could have done better, then they decide how many points, maybe 5, maybe 7. It's really up to them. And that just gives them a little bit of autonomy and ownership. The next activity is paragraph shrinking, and all of this happens together at one time. So the purpose of this activity is to build the skill of summarizing, not just saying the events in order, but kind of putting everything together into more of a coherent summary of the main idea. So they're still with their partner. This time they're stopping after each paragraph and doing a little summary. And the way they do the summary is after each paragraph, the coach stops the reader and says, name the most important who or what. So they have to name the main character in the paragraph. Then they say, tell the most important thing about the who or what. So they say what they think is most important. And then they say the main idea in 10 words or less. So they have to be able to kind of say the most important thing about the paragraph, but they can't just repeat the whole paragraph. They have to get it down to the most important information, which is actually quite challenging for kids. Often it's challenging for adults. So they really have to work hard, and they tend to work together on this to be able to come up with a really good main idea statement. Now on this activity, instead of earning a point for each sentence, they're actually just earning a point for each of those three things. So after they name the most important who or what, they get a point. After the most important thing, they get a point, and then they get 1 point for saying the main idea in 10 words or less. Questions about that?
1 point from here.
Yep. Yep. So it's just continuing to add on to the
So here
points.
they can get points not only from reading, but retelling.
Yep. For reading, for retelling, for answering these questions, they get points for all of those different things. Now, they also get help if they are having trouble identifying the most important information in the text. The coach can say, check it. If the reader is still having trouble finding the right answer, the coach says, let me give you a hint. And if they still can't figure it out, the coach can help them by saying what they think the answer is. And the most fun part is if the reader doesn't get it down to 10 words or less, then the coach says shrink it, and they have to condense it down further from there. So that's just the way of helping the reader.
But what about the role of teacher?
Yes, that's a good question. So the teacher at the beginning teaches the students how to do these activities, and that's what's in the manual. But then once they've learned all of the activities, the partners work together. But then it's the teacher's job to walk around the classroom and listen and help. Yep, so sometimes students, neither one of them knows a word, and so the teacher might need to help with that. The teacher might need to help them with the coaching piece, because sometimes kids don't really know how to be helpful to each other, so the teacher might be helping with that. But the teacher really needs to be paying attention and monitoring what's going on.
And it frees up the teacher a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, so she doesn't have to always be the one talking.
Right, exactly. And she can hear a lot of different students reading, which is hard to do if you have a class of 25 or 30 students or more, 40, then you probably don't have many opportunities to hear everybody read for a sustained period of time. But this way, the teacher is walking around and listening and can hear and maybe target the students who are of most concern. Prediction relay. In this activity, they are doing another important comprehension skill, which is thinking about what might happen next. So in this activity, the students, they're still with their partners, they're still taking 5-minute turns, but this time they start by making a prediction. So the coach will say, what do you predict will happen next? Read half a page, and then did your prediction come true? And so the reader does each of those things, makes a prediction, reads half a page, and then after the half page, they can say, yes, my prediction did come true, no, it didn't, or sometimes it's not clear. It might happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So they answer that question, and they earn 1 point again for each of those 3 steps.
For each of these 3.
Yep. So those are the activities very quickly. If we have time, I could actually pull up some examples. We could actually practice some together. I think that might actually be
Okay.
helpful. But I'll talk a little bit about the research and then I'll pull that up.
Okay.
So I'll share some of the research that supports using PALS to improve kids' reading, but I'll just talk a little bit about why we think it works to begin with. So one of the things that is beneficial about PALS is that it allows the teacher to differentiate instruction because kids can be reading from different texts. So sometimes we often have classrooms where it might be third grade, but you have kids reading at a first grade level and you have kids reading at a fifth grade level or higher, and it's really difficult to meet everybody's reading needs. And this is one way of kind of differentiating so that kids are reading from appropriate level texts. And then kids get help when they need it. So if it's just the teacher leading the whole group, they might not get around to every student and catch all of the mistakes that they're making, but this way the child has somebody helping them when they're making mistakes right away, which we know is important. This is why I think PALS works, because kids read a lot. In more typical classroom situations, we often have this sort of independent reading time, but a lot of kids aren't reading during that time. I've spent a lot of time in third and fourth grade classrooms during independent time and noticing that kids are doing lots of things, but they're not reading. And so with this, there's a structure in place so that they are supposed to be reading. They have a partner who's kind of keeping them on task, and they actually do get a lot of reading done in that time. They're either reading themselves or they're following along with their partner. These are the people who developed PALS. They're my mentors from Vanderbilt University, but they've been working on PALS since the 90s in both reading and math. And they and their colleagues around the country have been doing experimental research on PALS. Some of the research is still ongoing. And so there's quite a bit of evidence to support PALS effects. And across the research that's been done, they've worked in a lot of different kinds of schools. So schools in areas where there's high poverty, schools that are more middle class, urban, suburban, and rural settings, kids of all skill levels, kids with and without disabilities, and students learning English as a second language. And there's studies that kind of look at different aspects of PALS and different students. And generally have found very positive effects. With that said, I always like to point out that PALS won't work for everybody, and so then it's really important to be looking at whether kids are actually benefiting from PALS, and it won't be magic for everybody. The way that the research has been conducted is this kind of cyclical process where we start with the idea, test it out in classrooms, and all the PALS research has been done with classroom teachers implementing PALS and giving feedback along the way. So a lot of the components, including the point sheet, are actually teachers' ideas, where they'll say, you know, there needs to be something in place to keep kids motivated and on task. Let's try a point sheet. So teachers have had a lot of input into PALS, and then through that process, revisions are made, data from students are collected, and then we test it again. So this version of PALS, it was last updated in 2008, but it started in 1995 or so. So it's gone through several iterations based on teachers' feedback. Here are some data from one of the original PALS studies. So the Fuchs and their colleagues did a study where they worked with teachers in Nashville, Tennessee, which is south of here. They had about 40 teachers who they assigned randomly to either be PALS teachers or to serve as a control. So the control teachers just did their regular instruction. So in this graph, what we're seeing is the improvement that kids made after 16 weeks of PALS in terms of their reading fluency. So they had a measure where they read a passage aloud for 3 minutes, and basically the number of words they read correctly was counted. And the graph is showing how many more words or how much gain they made across the 16 weeks. So for example, kids with learning disabilities, the light blue bar are kids who had PALS, dark blue is the control. And the kids with LD who had PALS gained about 50 words, close to 50 words, whereas the control students gained about 30 words. That difference was statistically significant, but also a fairly large difference. And we see that pattern across low, average, and high achieving readers as well. Any questions about that? And then a similar result with a comprehension measure. On this measure, kids read, again, they read a text and then they were asked open-ended questions. They had 10 questions. They were inferential and factual questions about what they had read. And again, this is the gain that they made over the 16-week period. And again, the kids in PALS outperformed their counterparts in the control classrooms. So that was way back in the 1990s, just fairly recently, although it's not so recently anymore, about 10 years ago. I did some work with the Fuchs, so they are in Tennessee, which is in the middle there, and then we're up there in Minneapolis, and we had a colleague in Texas as well. And we did another study of PALS to see whether it was effective not only around Vanderbilt where it was developed, but in different parts of the country. And we were also interested in finding out whether teachers had to do PALS exactly as it is laid out in the book, or if they could sort of customize it and do it a little bit differently. So I'll tell you how that worked. So again, so this is kind of the way PALS is designed to work. There's the 4 activities that we just talked about. We do it for 35 minutes per session, 3 times a week. There's that reciprocal peer tutoring part where each child is doing both the coaching and the reading. And there's the motivational reinforcement system, which is the point sheet. So in our study, we had a group of teachers who did PALS by the book, which meant they had to do it exactly the way it was designed without changing it in any way. We also had a group of teachers who were able to customize PALS, but only certain elements of it. So we asked those teachers to do partner reading, paragraph shrinking. They had to have some motivational system. It didn't have to be points, but it had to be something that would keep kids interested and engaged. And it had to be 35 minutes per session. They couldn't change the time. But then they could customize elements of PALS, so they could make small changes just to make it better fit their classroom. They could make big changes, like they could change, instead of doing retell, they could do a completely different activity or a different activity than prediction relay. And the idea was that they could be very flexible, so they could do it one way for a while and then kind of change it and do it another way. Here are some of the ways that the teachers in the customized version changed it. Some of them added activities. This was a vocabulary activity, so not only were students doing the reading activities, but they were identifying words that they didn't know the meanings of and using strategies to figure out what those words meant. Other teachers came up with other kinds of strategies that kids needed to learn with reading. So asking questions while they read, evaluating what they read. So this was a little bit more in-depth as far as strategy use. Some teachers had a writing component. So instead of just saying the retell, they had kids write the retell down. And there were a whole bunch of other kinds of customizations. These are just some examples of changes that they made. Now, the way the study worked was there were 2 years that teachers went through. In their first year, they were randomly assigned to PALS or control. We pre and post tested their students. And then after the first year, then the teachers could choose whether they would keep doing PALS by the book or whether they would be in that group that customized PALS. So it's important to know that they had a whole year of doing it exactly as it's designed, and then they got to choose whether to change it or not. And then we did another year. Again, we pre and post tested their students in reading, and then we had 3 groups: the group that continued to do it by the book, the group that customized PALS, and then still a control group. And these are the numbers of teachers. We actually had 2 cohorts that went through 2 years, so it actually took us more than 2 years to do the study.
That would be really
Yeah.
ambitious.
Yeah, but in total, we had about 40-ish teachers in each group, 36 to 42. And we had quite a few students in each group. For the students, we looked at their word reading skills, their fluency, their vocabulary, and their comprehension using a number of different measures. And then we basically combined their performance on all of the measures to get one overall reading score that we would use for our analysis. And what we found, so first of all, this graph is a little bit different. What I'm showing here are effect sizes, which is basically how much one group the PALS group compared to the control. So this is in standard deviation units. So the light blue bar are all the students together, and it's showing that the students who had PALS outperform control groups by about a 0.25 of a standard deviation. And that was pretty similar for the dark blue are low performing students, white are average performing students, and black are high performing students. So basically what this means is that PALS did better than controls by kind of a small but statistically significant amount. A 0.25 effect size is not really exciting, but it's meaningful. It's not as big as the differences in the earlier study, though. The TD here is the by the book group, and this is showing how the classrooms that just did PALS by the book compared to the controls. And those effect sizes are actually pretty small. So if we had only had teachers do PALS by the book, we might have concluded that PALS is really not that effective after all. But then what we saw is that the teachers who customized PALS, again, they had a year of doing it by the book, and then they did it customized for a year. Their students actually benefited in terms of reading quite a bit. So overall, the light blue bar kids are performing at about 0.3 of a standard deviation above controls. For low performing students, the effect size is 0.4. For average, 0.27, and then for high performing kids, 0.37. And those differences are statistically significant, but also fairly decent in terms of effect sizes.
Customized were better than
Yeah.
because teachers were creative.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think, and we're not really sure why the customized teachers their students did better. It could be that they were creative because they did come up with some really interesting activities, and some of them were very good. Some of their customizations, though, were not. I mean, we kind of were wondering, are you really going to do that? But I think part of it is the teachers had more ownership over it. Like, instead of being told this is how you do it, they knew the basics of it, and they were implementing what we identified as really important parts, but they also had some flexibility to make it their own. And I think that was really important to those teachers, and it actually probably made it more interesting for the students too, because they were able to put some more variety into it and just make it more interesting and probably more appropriate for their specific students. We did look to see if there were any differences between the two groups in terms of just the teachers, the quality of the teachers or their backgrounds, or their overall teaching effectiveness, and we did not find any differences on any of those kinds of variables. So it's kind of interesting. So when we asked the question, did we successfully scale up PALS, meaning was it as effective in this study as it was in previous more controlled studies? Sort of, yes, we think so. But it's really important to point out that those conditions where they did do PALS with fidelity by the book for a year. They did do core elements of PALS, so partner reading and paragraph shrinking. They did it for 35 minutes a session, 2 or 3 times a week, and they also received support from our research team. And we don't know if without those things, the results might have been very different. What I take away from this is that as researchers, we need to do a really good job of explaining what the core components are versus what can be changed, because we know that teachers make changes to things, but if they understand you really ought to do these parts, but you can have flexibility with these other parts, then they're more likely to probably do the important parts and still feel like they can make changes that they wanted to make. There's this element of context too. So we've had other studies where we've noticed that PALS isn't always as effective as it was in the original studies, and we have to think about that. So when we try to do PALS in different places, there should be some flexibility to adapt it to the particular conditions. And that's where I think if you were interested in doing PALS in Armenia, or we've talked with colleagues in India about doing PALS, it's really important to think about the context there and what aspects of PALS might fit well and what might need to be changed in that context. And then we also have evidence that teachers do need some sort of ongoing support, so just doing one workshop doesn't necessarily lead to successful implementation. There should be some ongoing problem solving and support that teachers get. This is the website. I can see if I can go there, actually. Or will it work with the, I'm not sure if I can.
Maybe. And I can stop the recording.
Yeah.
Because we have the, yeah, okay.